Hey everybody, I'm Jack Reedy with Future Pastimes, and this is Battle Language, which is a format that I like to use where I can bring in other guests to talk about different subjects regarding the classic Dune board game. And I have a special guest today, and it's Brad Johnson. And a lot of you who know Dune will definitely know Brad. He's been basically running the Dune tournament at the WBC since 2001, so over 20 years, and has won it at least once, right, Brad? Was that before you were in charge?
I did win it the first year I went there, actually, and
Nice.
fell in love and played ever since. And when the GM at that time decided to leave, he asked me to take it over, and I've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, that's great. I actually got to go myself in person last year, and I wasn't there for the whole thing, and did not fare very well in in either of the games that I played. But it was a lot of fun to be there. It's great to just be around with a lot of people who really enjoy Dune and are really good at it, which is great. And I think for me, the biggest treat for me was like I've played online with Bill Dyer for a while, who I know you've known for a long time, and Bill's sons were both there, and they were both in my game, and they basically waxed the rest of us with their gameplay. They were definitely of the same mind, and they were doing really well. And they've won it. They've each won it at least once as well in more recent years. But so yeah, it's just great seeing the different generations of Dune enthusiasts in there, and that's a little bit related to our topic for today. We're actually going to be talking about the recently announced Kwisatz Haderach edition of Dune that GaleForceNine announced recently as part of a Gamefound for 2025. So they've got a preview page up on Gamefound, and we'll have a link in the description. And it's got very little detail about what all is in there. So it's Dune. They've got some nice quotes about what a great game it is and some of its awards, and then it talks about, if you subscribe to it now, you'll get an exclusive Shai Halud. I don't know what it is, a token or a coin or something like that. Just if you end up pledging. But when they announced it, they did it as part of something that GameFound does called the Game Feast, which is a way that they can highlight stuff that's going to be featured on there. And they interviewed one of the heads of GaleForceNine slash Battlefront, and he talked about there's going to be new material that'll be part of it, a lot of deluxe components, new ways to play Dune. I think he even mentioned Spice Harvest, and so I'm mentioning that as well. And that was an original expansion back in the Avalon Hill edition, part of two that Future Pastimes did, that and the Duel. And I always felt like the Spice Harvest one was a much better one. But as a member of Future Pastimes, I can tell you that we have reimagined it, improved upon it. It's much better than it was. It is going to be great. That's probably all I can really say at this point. But we don't really know much about what is going to be in here, and there's certainly been a lot of discussions. There's 300 comments currently on the GameFound page, and a lot of it is just people, asking, will it have this? Will it do that? Will it have other languages? But then there's a lot of people saying, please do this, please have that. I know there's a lot of questions about solo mode, and I can tell you that's definitely not going to be part of it. Although, I say that, and then at some point, GaleForce9 will be like, do some kind of solo mode. I don't know if it's possible, and but that's one of the things that I wanted to have Brad on to talk about. And I mentioned in a thread about the Kwisatz Haderach edition on Board Game Geek that, in my view, I feel like there's two different pathways that GaleForce9 can kind of go down with this edition. And we don't know yet at Future Pastimes if it's going to be one or the other or some sort of hybrid in between. But the two paths that I see is one that it's the same edition that you've been known that you've been playing since 2019, but it's just focused on upgraded components, so make a bigger board. They mentioned a possibility of a 3D board, really nice, maybe stackable components for the forces. Maybe deluxe, better versions of the faction sheets. Who knows? There's a lot of stuff. I have a lot of deluxe components that I get on Etsy, so they might do stuff like that. But Path 2 is anything that is really a change. Like, we're going to change these rules, or we're going to change these factions. And it's what I like to think of as a potential second edition of the GaleForceNine version. Some people are like, well, the GaleForceNine version is second edition of Dune, and I guess that's technically true. But I'm talking about fundamental changes to some of the rules. And so that's the other reason I really wanted to talk to Brad, because I know that Brad has mentioned a few things, like I hope they'll maybe change some things about the Bene Gesserit, and maybe beef up the Fremen or stuff like that. So that's what I'm interested in discussing, and I know that a lot of you will be interested to hear what we think, and what we hope is going to happen. So I'm going to start by asking you, Brad, if you had to pick between, we're just going to bling up the game with just really high-end, high-quality components, but not really change anything, or if it's a matter of, well, we are going to entertain the idea of pushing the envelope on a possible second edition with some changes. What would be your preference, especially somebody who kind of came up through the Avalon Hill edition? And that's the edition that you guys used at WBC for quite a while. And it's more recently that you've embraced the GaleForceNine one as part of the official tournament approach. So what are some of your initial thoughts? And let's explore that for a bit.
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, yes, we did play Avalon Hill rules and that edition exclusively at the WBC until Gale Force 9 put the new second edition out. And then that was during COVID, actually, or right before.
Yeah.
And then we missed WBC for a couple of years. And so when we came back, I moved directly to the Gale Force 9 version. So that is what we've played basically ever since it came out. And don't stay tied to the past, right? Look to the future. And Gale Force 9 and you and future Pastimes are providing some really outstanding support for the game. More expansions, online support, and it's just fabulous. So why not go with that? My thoughts on a Gamefound for a new edition of Dune is that you pretty much can't have a nice, cool, splashy crowdfunding project these days unless you've got really snazzy components. So, my opinion is like you almost have to do that. And there's just to attract the attention that you're going to want. So I anticipate that that's almost for sure going to happen. There'll be fancy new components. And I, for one, think that's great. Something to just freshen it all up and make you feel like you're playing a really premium game is fabulous.
Yeah.
But and I'm here for it. I'd be in for that, no doubt. Heavyweight chips and counters and so on, as you've discussed, would be great. But as a student of Dune, I guess for 40 plus years now, I'm most interested in seeing if some of the rules gaps and holes could be clarified and cleaned up, and maybe even a few balance tweaks. I'll be honest, that's what I was really hoping for when I first heard that Gale Force 9 was putting out a new edition. And I know that, to get it to market, they were trying to keep it as true to the original as possible with minimal changes. And so I understand that's how it went. But this could be a great opportunity. And I don't think you have to go either or. I think without doing dramatic changes to the rules, there's some opportunities to just do a little bit of cleanup that doesn't require any component changes or significant rule changes. Just tighten up a few things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, I think part of it is what's interesting is even during the accelerated pace that they tried to get that 2019 edition to print, and part of that plan was they used and licensed the existing art that Ilya had put online for people who are print and playing their own version of it. And there were a couple of artists who had done that, and they settled on Ilya, and they paid him for the art so that they could say, look, we're ready to go, we can go to print. But then the Future Pastimes guys and Ian Allen from Seventh Son Games, who was a longtime Dune enthusiast, they sort of sat down and crunched out a quick rule book and tried to make some improvements. But I think a lot of the stuff that they were definitely considering and trying to figure out were some of the house rules and rules changes that had been part of the WBC tournament scene, and trying to reconcile certain things about that. So there were definitely some changes to the factions and certain other elements of gameplay between the Avalon Hill version and the GaleForceNine version. So there are some differences. Probably, and I think famously now, or maybe infamously would be a better way to describe it, is the Bene Gesserit treatment. And I've talked about this in a few other videos, but there's some great innovations with the tokens in that you've got this great, you can flip them, and you've got a very clear visual indicator of coexistence between them and another faction in the same territory. But this sort of state for the tokens didn't exist in the Avalon Hill edition, and so when you're trying to reconcile the rules, there was definitely some gaps, and there were some cracks that a few bits of clarification definitely fell through, and the Bene Gesserit obviously, quite clearly, is the most difficult for new players to fully grasp, and has the most nuances, and it has the longest section in the FAQ, and even after the FAQ, there's been a lot of continuing questions, and certainly that was exacerbated by the fact that there were some contradictions in the FAQ, in the early FAQ versus the later FAQ. So it is a little bit of a hot mess, which is at the top of our list, I think, for the Kwisatz Haderach edition, is if nothing else, we've got to revisit that rule book, and we've got to clarify a lot of things and maybe rewrite the faction sheet for the Bene Gesserit so that it's a little bit clearer, makes sense, and maybe is, I know that Peter Alaka hates when any of us ever says the word balanced, but I think there's definitely some balancing that needs to happen, because one of the kind of ongoing controversies that we have is, you've got the Bene Gesserit has got an advisor in Carthag, and you've got one faction is in there and the other one is allied with the Bene Gesserit, and they're like, I'm going to go in here and fight these guys. And then, we fought it out, and I know that if I full dial, you're just going to be able to flip, and then we win the game. And there's a lot of people who are like, that doesn't seem right. And three of them are Jack Kittredge, Bill Eberly, and Peter Alatka. They're like, I don't, that's not really what we ever envisioned. And I'm not even sure that the Avalon Hill guys envisioned it that way. And there's just been a lot of people who kind of go back and forth about, should that be how it's done? Should the allies even be able to be in the same territory with advisors? And I'm from the school of, the advisors are supposed to just not even be on the board for all intents and purposes. They can be killed by worms and storms and explosions, but they can't do anything, and they can't count as anything. And that's the thing. But you've got this clear thing on the faction sheet, which talks about if you're ever alone with an advisor, you just flip automatically. And so,
and to be honest, going all the way back to the original Avalon Hill, which were, my understanding is those rules were added by Avalon Hill developers after Future Pastimes' original design.
Yeah.
And the Bene Gesserit coexistence rules, as they were known at that time, were some of the least well-defined parts of the rules even then. So there's a lot of legacy here in difficulty and how coexistence works. And years of leading the convention tournament at WBC, it's one of the four main areas where I get questions, and still do, and so I think tightening that up is one of the top four things I would look at. And I know you've been talking about it all. I think that with the rules as they currently exist, it really made the Bene Gesserit even stronger. And in the records I've had, hundreds of games over 20 years with hundreds of unique opponents, um, BG tend to be one of the winningest factions
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
overall, and so they don't really need that extra help. In
No.
fact, I think it could be toned back a little bit. But I think the two areas that cause it is the auto flip rule, as you've said.
Yeah.
I forget what it might have a name in the rules, but where you can do that surprise takeover during at the end of battle phase, essentially. And the other one is actually the intrusion rule, where you can just essentially choose to avoid any battle you don't choose to participate in most of the time. And that makes the Bene Gesserit really strong. They're very, very hard to pin down and bring to a battle when they're weak.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And so that's going to be a priority, even if GaleForceNine says, look, we don't really want to do an official new edition. I know we're calling this the Kwisatz Haderach edition, but they can also just say that's just a flowery way to describe this whole campaign. It's not technically a different edition of the game, but I think that we would still put out a different faction sheet, and we'd say, look, you're going to get a new version of the Bene Gesserit faction sheet that clarifies a few things, and I think we would still probably tweak some of that. It would be clear whether or not the advisors could be in a territory with their ally, which I think they should be, because I think I would go back to that original idea of they just don't
you
count as
just
it being on
act
the
as if
board.
they
Yeah,
don't count. Yep, I
but
think that's the cleanest way to do it.
the Nova flipping, and that's what the online community calls it now, which is where you're like, oh, I just get to flip because I'm suddenly alone after my ally has cleared out the riffraff. That I would probably say I don't think they need that. I think once they have declared that they are not flipping, before the shipping and movement phase, then they're there to coexist with whoever is there or not there, and I'd leave it at that. I think the other big thing, so I've pulled this one out, is the truth trance, which is the other meddlesome FAQ
Yep.
hornet's nest of controversy. And it's funny because I've done probably a couple videos here about this, and part of it is just kind of talking about the way that my group always played it. And so, I think for many people, this is your Dune experience. Is like, well, we've always played it this way. And so even if it's technically not the right way, this is just what we're used to. But we were kind of sticklers for the lore. And this was, I learned the game before I read the book, but I read the book and then we were all just kind of gaga for it. But the idea of, the truth trance it was not linked to prescience. It was just an interrogation thing. And so we never tried to use it as a trap to try to trick somebody into committing to a future action.
Right.
And then you're like, now you must abide by this because you told the truth. And even if, it's like, let's say, for instance, we're in the Dune universe and I'm being interrogated by a truth sayer. And they say, are you going to be shipping into Carthag on turn 8 and playing a laser gun or whatever? Even if I say yes, that's the thing. By the time I get to turn 8 and I look and I see, the Fremen have got 10 forces in there and I've got no chance of beating them, I'm not going in there. And I wouldn't be bound by that in the Dune universe. They wouldn't be like, oh, well, there's nothing that's going to prevent the Emperor from going in there because he said he was going to go in there. It's absurd. So I think this is an area where we would want to clean up, again, what the card does and make it as clear as we can. I mean, there's only so much text you can put on there and before it becomes absurd. But we'd want to be like, here's how it works. Here's what the intent is or something along those lines so that you can get I mean, this can still be a very effective card. It can be a very powerful card, and
Oh
I still
yeah.
think you want to have two of them in the game because it's a really useful tool, even if you limited yourself to stuff that makes thematic sense and is not just this
Yep.
goofy.
And
Um,
it's thematically fun,
yeah,
and it's kind of a unique feature. Where have you ever seen another game
yeah.
that has a card that lets you do something like that
You
in the game?
must answer a yes or no. It's funny too that they've included this. It's got to be about the game. That had and I was like, I imagine the stories of why did they
We
feel
used
they
to
had to
joke
do?
about
Yeah,
that. We used to joke about that for sure. But yeah, we played it. I mean, in my time of playing the game, um, we started out and with traditional types of questions, just yes or no questions. Do you have this much spice? Are you going to play this card in this battle that we're in right now?
is,
And so
is
on.
Jessica
Is
your
this guy
traitor?
your
Yeah,
traitor?
exactly.
That kind of stuff. And this idea of I watched this idea of asking these trap questions that are essentially prescience or mind control type of questions develop over time, mostly in the tournament. As people became more and more and more competitive, they were looking for unique ways to surprise opponents and come up with a way to win. And I watched players develop this, and I had to, at first, I ruled that sure, that's allowed. It's a yes or no question. And then it became more and more and more problematic over time. And since we moved to the GF9 edition, so for the last few years, I've ruled just how you've described that um, truth trans questions have to be something that you can answer that is provably true.
Yeah,
So basically about static information in the game. Now that being said, there's this funny gray area. What I've always seen in all the years I've played the game, the number one use for truth trance is, are you playing such and such a card in this battle?
yeah,
And that has some people say, well, that also is a forcing thing because I don't know what I'm playing yet. Well, I've ruled that that is still allowed to be asked. Not only is it the most popular use for the question, but I still believe you ask it while the battle plans are being set, and you can answer that. You can wait until you're just about ready to reveal how you answer, like figure out what you are putting in your battle plan, and then answer yes or no. Um, but I still feel like that really does need to be allowed, even though it's a little bit in the gray zone. But otherwise, how, do you have this much spice? Is this guy your traitor? Those are all valid questions. And I think you could word it so that all of that is covered and well defined. What's allowed, what's not allowed. I went as far as to make a list of the templates of valid questions that you could ask.
yeah.
And I don't know if that would be suitable for the new rules, but we could certainly talk about it.
Yeah, well,
Anyway,
there was a thing that you said when I was at the WBC tournament last year. You had brought up at the beginning before everyone started their games. You talked about some sort of general ground rules and whatever, but you did mention truth trance, and the thing that you said that really stuck with me that I was like, oh, this is perfect, and it is perfect for a tournament scenario. But you had said, it's got to be something that I could be brought in as the administrator of the tournament to verify. And I was like, all right, I know that that's not a practical thing for a general rule book where like some arbiter of the game will verify, but I like that concept as a way to frame in your own mind how is a truth trance intended to work. It's got to be something that is it could be verifiably true, as you said. So yeah, I like that, and I think that's a good approach, and it's a good example of something that we can and we should address with the new edition. Similarly, there's a number of cards. You get these questions like, is this card that doesn't say you can keep it after a battle? Can you keep it after a battle? And we should just be a little bit more consistent with all of that
yep,
stuff, and just make sure that people know that
yeah,
this is a universal rule, and we've gone so far as to really clear that up on all of the cards. And it's nice that we're benefiting now from several years of even just the GaleForceNine edition, but the other decades worth of Dune and the various FAQs. to be able to say where can we make some improvements and where can we clear up and clarify some things. So even if it isn't an official new edition where we're changing anything, we can at least make it easier and lower the barrier to entry and enjoyment for people who are going in, because it's not a hard game to learn, it's not necessarily hard to play, but it is a game with a lot of nuances that a new player is just not going to be aware of. They're not going to know
That's right.
the makeup of the treachery deck and the possibilities. I remember the first time that somebody played Family Atomics. I'd probably played 2 or 3 games of Dune before it showed up, and I didn't even know that was a possibility. And I was like, well, that's great. It's so wonderfully thematic, but if you don't know that and you're like, great, I've camped out, I'm putting all my forces in Arakeen because it's a good location and whatnot, with no knowledge of like, oh yeah, if without the shield wall, that's trouble, and you're going to be really
Yeah.
hurting when the storm makes its way around. So I think
No,
that's the nature of the beast, but there are certain other things that we can do to make people be able to jump into a game a little more quickly and feel like they're not overwhelmed.
yeah, I agree with that. You see it often in online discussions. New players go, basically, what did we do wrong? I just don't get this game.
Yeah.
The rules are not hard to understand. Most, at least the main framework of rules. Once you start adding in all the special cases and edge cases and so on, it starts getting more complicated. But you can sit down, read the rules, and start playing. But new players don't know what to do or why, and I think it'd be interesting to provide some guidance there, a little bit, like you say, an explanation of what's there, why it's there, what to watch out for, some tips for your first turns. That'll, of course, be very general because every group kind of learns their own way of playing the game, and different groups have different styles, so you can't get real prescriptive about what new players should or should not do, but you can encourage them certain ways and at least provide the rationales for why you would do this or why would you think about this and not think about that.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting for sure.
I think one of the areas that I would want to highlight too is the social nature of the game, or at least the social potential for it, because it's not immediately apparent that that's a component of the game. And I think the deal making and the bribing is a part of that, but I think Dune shines the most when you are engaging the other players and trying to convince them to do or not to do certain things, whether or not you incentivize them. It's still, I think, an important element, and it really is. I mean, that's the way. Again, it's the way that we always played it, and so we really feel like we got a lot out of it. It felt even more thematic to us.
Hmm.
It was less of a lot of the other games that we were playing. It was very straightforward. Move your piece there, do this, and I think Dune lends itself to that social aspect a lot more. And I think every time when I teach people to play it, almost without exception, they walk away with like, that is an amazing game, and even if they didn't do particularly well, they see it. They don't feel like, oh, I had to. I lost the battle, and so I had like 8 forces in the tanks, and I was pretty much done. So I just sat there and didn't do anything. And when other people were taking their turns, I didn't bother paying attention, and I was like, there's so much you could be doing,
Yep.
even when you've taken a hit. There's still there are ways you can get back in. There's ways that you can maneuver the other players to take pity on you, or to take advantage of a certain thing, or to say, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of other things going on, and of course, a more seasoned player would maybe not have foolishly, bum rushed an opponent without certain card knowledge or other things in the game. Again, stuff that you don't necessarily know your first time going in. You're like, oh, I went in there and then I lost. I only dialed a 2, and it didn't occur to me if I just look at the math and I know, well, your highest leader is a 5, so as long as I dial a 3, or a 6, I can't really lose this battle. A lot of people, they're not aware that certain things can be calculated.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think just letting people know that helps to ease them into
Yeah.
things and makes them a little bit more enjoyable experience overall.
Agree. Some beginner tips, and then tips, so you've lost a major battle,
Yes.
like some tips on what should you be doing while you're recovering, and to stay in the game, because I agree with you that that's one of the hallmarks of Dune for me is you're never truly out, and you can always do something, and I've seen players come back from nothing and win the game.
Yeah.
So it's about the resilience. But anyway, you talked about two of my top things that I would tighten up in the rules: coexistence advisors and truth trances. I agree with that. That's one of the other top four areas I get questions about.
Yeah.
Um, the and you mentioned one of the others is um, bribery, essentially, or deal making or negotiating, which I agree with you is an absolutely fundamental part of the game. And we know we've heard the tales online how, like, the original designers didn't even have that as part of the game, and they don't even play that way today. I think you've said it
Yep.
online, and people are surprised, and there actually is like a subset of players who really don't like that aspect of the game, and they play it just as a dudes on a map game. And and I think that's um, surprising to me. We've also always had negotiation heavy games. Every action can be debated and negotiated and bribed potentially, but those rules about how spice flows between players in the game, I think there was recent discussions about that, so it's kind of uppermost in my mind too. But I get tons of questions about that every game. Can I, especially after the advent of the GF9 edition, because it's kind of changed things. In the Avalon Hill edition, anybody could bribe anybody anytime, and now you can't bribe allies, but you can give allies money for certain expenses, or you can pay for their expenses. And so it's become even more confusing, I think, now. And I've seen people ask, why is it this way? And I'd I'd love to see that all tightened up a little bit more, just defined better,
Yeah.
and who can do what, when can spice change hands, and why, and and it feeds into the whole emperor's powers as well. So it's a little bit slippery, but with the current FAQ definitions, the emperor can give spice to his ally at any time, which essentially equates to the emperor's ally gets all the free cards he wants all the time. And I have been feeling more and more that maybe needs to be touched a little bit as part of the overall when can spice change hands rules, perhaps, because it tends to lead to some very stalematey games where the cards are really being monopolized, even if the Emperor's alliance can't win, but they're taking all the cards so nobody else can win either. And it's I've felt more and more like maybe that needs to be scaled back somehow. But that starts getting into this slippery slope of changing the player powers, which is maybe a step too far for where this edition would want to go.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I've often felt the same way, and one of my little pet projects is I have something I've been developing that I call Dune Abomination, and I call it Abomination because I'm changing the rules, and some people would feel like that's an abomination, but it started off as just a tabletop simulator only approach, but I've been making more and more physical components so that I can do it in real life, and I'm actually going to be playing a big game of Dune Abomination in May. And I do have some fundamental changes to some of the factions. And for like the Emperor, one of mine is that he can give the ally as much spice as he wants, but it's only up to a certain point in the round. And at that point,
Right.
the ally just has to be like, all right, you gave me a bunch of spice, so I'm going to use some of it for a card, some of it for shipping, and that's that. It's just you do your best, and they pay for the card, they give that spice back to the emperor, and so he's like, fine, I can do with this, but I think it would be more interesting because you have to be a lot more thoughtful and careful
Yep.
as the emperor, thinking about, all right, I'm going to give you some of this spice, but I need you to make sure that you buy at least two cards, and I need you to do this, that, or the other. And so I think that would be fun to play around with, and that's part of the point of my doing this is I'm curious to see how these changes work and if they're well received. And if they are, and it does turn out that GaleForceNine is entertaining the ideas of changes, I think we as future pastimes would want to know what changes work, what makes sense, and that they've been play tested. And because
Right.
sometimes you can have a small change will have a really big and maybe even unexpected effect on some other aspect of the game. So it might have started off as a fairly innocuous little tweak, but you're like, well, now you've got this situation that was nobody could foresee, and now it's terrible. So we want to do
And
that.
talking about, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Talking about what you hope for in the new edition. I mean, that's really what I would love to see, something that just totally freshens the game up that way. And what I think is that you could, with quite little cost, essentially just include two rule sets in the box. Like have a rule book for Classic Dune, maybe just a slightly cleaned up version of the GF9 edition, and then have, Dune Abomination, if you want to call it that, or Dune Kwisatz Haderach, and with new rules, new player abilities, as long as you could play it with the components, the exact same components, no changes needed to the components.
Yeah.
It's just changes in the player powers, so maybe there's just a second set of player aid cards, and that's all you would need. And think of the excitement that you would generate with the crowdfunding that way. Like not only a super fancy version of Classic Dune, but a whole new set of rules to play. And that was kind of my expectation when they announced a whole new way to play. That's kind of all we know that's coming.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's
And
the beauty. That's the beauty of a crowdfunded project like what they're doing on Gamefound is that you've got the flexibility to offer quite an array of things. I know that if, like, for instance, they were going to say, let's just change some of the artwork, they'd still probably want to offer anything new with the classic style of the art, because there's going to be some people who are like, look, I just want the new stuff. I don't necessarily want any changed things. And there'll be some people who are like, oh, if there's going to be a new edition, I definitely want the new edition. A lot of them, they just put out a third expansion, so I can understand a lot of people who are like, I don't want to pay to overhaul everything that I had, but if I can get the updated version of Bene Gesserit with the old style faction sheet, and that's really all I need, as sort of a la carte approach, I think a lot of people would respond to that, and you'd have various different pledge levels where somebody's like, I'm all in on everything, and I want the giant box that looks like a sandworm, or whatever this box is going to look like, and some people are like, I just want I want all the new stuff in the old style, and it's easy for them to find those swim lanes worth of components, and
yeah,
they can say, look, we have to reach this level of funding for these things to happen, and we can say, look, if we hit $1 million, then we'll be able to offer these things. I mean, it's nice that they've already got 11,000 people who are just subscribed to the campaign. Now, that not all of them will back it, and they certainly won't all back everything, but for something that's still a year away, I think that with no information really about what is going to be in there, that's a pretty good sign. So I think that there's every reason to think that if they do just go hog wild with all kinds of deluxe stuff, but some new stuff, and then even a new edition, that you're gonna reach a very wide audience of people. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that they're gonna do that. They did last year. They did a Gamefound for their 10th anniversary of Firefly, and they put out a really big, beautiful crate that holds the base game and all of the expansions. They had new stuff as well. They had a lot of deluxe components, and it was a very popular campaign. So that's a lot of people who already had most of that stuff already, but they still wanted a lot of the stuff. And a lot of people are like, yeah, I'll get everything. So I think it really exceeded their expectations about what that could do. And that I think is what led them to think, yeah, let's apply that same thing to Dune, because there's a lot of interesting potential with what we could
Yeah.
do. For me, like a little thing is I got these guild guys out. So in my Abomination edition, I've replaced most of these leaders. It's funny because the only guild representative in the guild is guild rep, who doesn't even have a name. Everybody else is kind of a smuggler, or they're at best adjacent to the guild itself. And I think this opens up the potential. I know there's a lot of people who have homebrewed their own smuggler faction. That could potentially be something that they say, all right, we've got new leaders for the guild, and now we're putting the old leaders into their own faction. I think a lot of people would respond to that. I would make a slight tweak to the guild's stall out victory condition, that just requires them maybe to have a little bit more skin in the game in order to win, rather than just, oh, I'm putting all my effort into stopping somebody else from winning because I know I've got it in the bag. That's something that, again, we'd have to play test it. We'd have to take the temperature of the Dune community to say, all right, how do you feel about this? But I like that, and I think the benefit of this being a year out is that we have this chance to engage with the Dune community. And I look at it as the longtime players, the more recent ones, and those who have said, Dune's not really for me, at least not in its current form, because I want to understand what it is. What is their barrier to entry? I know that that advanced combat is a very controversial thing, where there's a lot of people who are saying, hey, we've come up with our system for all of the advanced elements of the game without the combat, and things like the leaders are worth twice as much, which I don't think works. I think it's not a good idea, but I understand their pain. And I know, because I've seen some people's eyes glaze over as I'm explaining dialing 2.5 on your dial, and you've got some Sardaukar in that battle and some normal, but not enough spice for everybody. And so you're doing this, and they're like, no, can we just play a different game? So I've been there. I've seen it happen. And a lot of times I'm like, you know what? I'm just sticking to the basic rules to teach the people.
Hmm.
But now I kind of feel like, you know what, we have Dune Conquest, which is the simplest entry point into Dune that you can get, and I think it works, and I think it's nice that it's streamlined, it's quick, and it's got the heart of the battle system. So for me, if there's a new edition of Dune, I would do what Shut Up and Sit Down said in their great review of Dune. They liked everything except the thing that they hated was there's basic rules and then there's advanced rules. And they're like, we just wish there was one rule set. And I'm kind of the same way. I would love to see if we could thread the needle between the elegance and the beauty of basic combat, which is so easy to explain and so original, but still having a little bit of the spice surprise that you get with advanced combat. I think for me, the best thing about advanced combat is that X factor of, I don't know necessarily how much spice you have or how much spice you are willing to spend
Exactly.
to pump that dial up a little bit more. So I like that X factor. So I'd want to keep that in some way, but also find a way to say, look, the great thing about basic is you just say, here's how many forces you are willing to sacrifice in order to win this battle. And it's such a great way to describe it. It is what it is. And it's easy to understand, and people like that. They're like, "Oh, I was willing to sacrifice them all," and it's like, and their eyes light up with the possibilities of it. But when you're like, "Oh, half of these guys are half strength, and half of them are maybe full strength, and they're just like, oh, I don't know if I can handle that. I don't know if it's worth it. And so I understand that. So that would be for me personally the top of the list of things to look at for a second in quotes edition of Dune, and seeing how many hopefully thousands of people who have been avoiding it or tried it once and wouldn't come back to be like, all right, this maybe is the edition for me, something that its net catches the most people. That for me as a designer, that's what I would like to see. But I know that there are some people who they live and die on the hill of advanced combat, and like my friend Charles he's part of that. I'm trying to convince by having him play Dune Abomination. We'll see if my crack at a change will make sense to him. If I can win him over, then I think there's hope for even the most hardcore grognars out there, and we'll see where it
Well,
goes. But yeah,
I'd definitely be interested to see what you're cooking up there because I agree with you, and I think it's absolutely astounding the popularity and interest in Dune the game as a 40-plus-year-old game. I mean, how many others can you say that about? How many other 40-year-old games have that level of interest today? And I think that the unique battle system is one of the main reasons for that. You just don't find it anywhere else. There's some games since that have reused bits and pieces of it,
yeah,
but that interplay of leaders, uh, token count, and cards in your hand, and then plus spice when you're playing advanced combat is just fascinating to everyone who learns the game, I think. And if you can remove that obstacle of some people just don't like dialing halves and doing that extra math, which I respect and understand. I've never felt that way myself. I've always played from the time I learned it in high school in roughly 1981 or 1980. We've always played advanced combat, so I've never known anything different really. But I understand what people are saying. It's not that elegant. It's a little hard to grok. If we could get something that works around that and just eliminates that as an obstacle, it would be fabulous and retains the whole feel that we have today.
right.
I'd love it. So yeah, I'm totally on board with many of the things you're saying here. I do think that what I've seen is that the guild default victory condition at the end of the game does lead the guild to tend to play as a spoiler the whole time, and it can make games very draggy and stalematy. I'd love to see something a way for them to be more have to play more proactively. Maybe they have a special end game condition, but it's something that requires more dynamic, proactive play. I'd love to see that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about maybe it's an elephant in the room, but it's the out of the things that I think need to be still tidied up in the rules, even after all the attempts to do so. Number one source of questions that I field in the tournament, Karamas. It's always, can I do this? When can I do this?
Yeah.
What happens if I do this? And in a way, I think GaleForceNine tried to make it simpler by just saying you can cancel any power. But that actually made it more complicated. It made it worse. And so there's more to deal with. And some of the things that you can theoretically cancel, nobody ever does. Karama's like maybe the most valuable card in the game. And nobody wants to spend it on preventing one BG advisor from landing, for example.
Yeah.
So, I feel like this is an area, without changing the nature of the game, this could just be tightened up a lot. Like, bring it down to, okay, in Dune Conquest, there's one power for each player that you can cancel. Maybe that's too far, but if you tighten it down to that, like here are the things you can do with this. It's a finite number of things that are each well defined, and you could have it on a player aid card.
Yeah.
That would help everybody, I think.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's fun that we at Future Pastimes have the experience we had at designing Dune Conquest and having to look at where can we streamline the game, where can we make it more accessible to players, was a very educational experience for us, and it's something that I have been thinking about a lot, especially as I look at what I would do with Dune as I'm fiddling around with Abomination. And so Karama is definitely an area where I definitely have been tinkering with it. I started around the same time that you did with My Avalon Hill. It was the early '80s, and what was funny about those cards was there was no text on them. It was just funny little illustrations, and then you had a separate sheet that you would reference for what does a Kurama do. And so when we got the GaleForceNine one, and I was like, oh, there's no image for Kurama, and it's because it's this wall of text. And it reminded me of like, there's so much that the Karama is trying to do. And I started to feel like, I think it's trying to do too much. And I think on top of that, you've got this issue that you mentioned where you've got some factions, the Emperor only has two things that he can do. But, if you're looking at the Fremen and the Bene Gesserit, they got a pile. And most of these expansion factions have got a number of things as well. And so it does get very convoluted with it. And then you get the timing of things. So if it's like Sardaukar, am I able to Kurama you after the battle plans are revealed, and what kind of effect does that have on what you've dialed? And now do we have to retroactively adjust things? And it's really inelegant, and it's quite a mess. And so what I've done, and I recently did a video and I did talk about it. It's called Experimental Cards. But one of the things that I've done is I've actually taken Kurama and I've broken it into two different cards. So there's one that's still called the Karama, and that does two things. One is that it lets you activate your once per game effect, which I have put on the faction sheets, something I do expect to see in the Kwisatz Haderach edition. Like, if nothing else, we're going to put the Karama effect on the sheet, so you're not having to flip through the rule book to figure out what it is you can do and when you can do it. But the other thing is that it lets you cancel an advantage. But in my Abomination version, I have gone a step further, and I have singled out one advantage that can be affected by Karama. And I've put a little Karama symbol either at the beginning of the advantage or at the end of it, which signifies when you would have to play it. So for like the voice, and so for the Bene Gesserit, it's the voice. That's the one thing that they get Karama the most often. So I was like, well, that's what the Karama is going to affect. And I've put it at the end, and that signifies that you, as the holder of the Karama, get to hear what the voice is before you decide to cancel it, so that there's none of this, I'm announcing that I'm about to use the voice. Does anyone wish to Karama? Nobody wants that experience. And then the other card that I've done is I've created a card called Solaris, which is the actual monetary system of the Dune universe. And that one takes care of, you can get a treachery card for free. And I've clarified it because I was never for me, Brad, I was never that big into the idea of I'm using this card that I'm not playing to drive up a bid with more spice than I actually have. That just made my skin crawl. So I don't like it. So I've just changed that. It's for my edition. Whether it happens, we can debate that. But I also wanted to avoid the infinity +1 thing. So you play the Solaris card when it's your turn to bid to just take the card. So that's how it works.
And that's essentially how I ask that the Karama be played now.
And then you get the guild rates for the shipping paid to the bank is the other thing that card does. So I've got two Karamas and two Solaris in my personal deck. And then again, all the faction sheets are marked with the one thing that can be affected by it. And then I have one nice little reference that doesn't have to be 3 pages long that just says, here's how everybody's Karama can be affected. It lets you know, for the Atreides, it's prescience, and for the Bene Gesserit, it's this, and for the Emperor, it's this other thing. So it narrows it down. It streamlines it, I think, so that it's easier to manage. and it's just a little more intuitive for the players so that they can sort it out, and they're not worried about can I Karama this? How do I Karama? How does a Karama work on this effect? And you're like, it just doesn't. So now you don't have to worry about it. And again, it's another one of those things that I know that some people will be like, oh, I hate that they changed that. But in my heart of hearts, I think that a majority of people will be like, yeah, I think in the long run this makes more sense, and it is easier. It's certainly going to be easier to teach people, and more manageable to play, and fewer questions and conflicts. And that's the goal. Is I don't want to do anything that makes the game of Dune last longer than it does, because it's already, if people want to complain about Dune, they'll be like, well, how come the game takes 6 hours to play? And it's like, well, I think we can knock 45 minutes off of that by streamlining a few things. It's still going to be a long game, and that's how I describe it to people. I say Dune is an epic game, so strap in, because we're gonna be playing it for a few hours. If it only goes 2 turns, then it'll be pretty short. But there's not a lot of good reasons why it should go one or 2 turns. Smart players can prevent an early win unless all the stars have really aligned for a particular faction, storm order, and the cards that they have, and the decisions that the other players have made. It can still happen even with really advanced players, but most of the time you're going 3 to 6 turns on average, and then, or it's going all 10. So that's
Yeah.
where you end up. And I think if we can find ways to streamline the gameplay a little bit, so that each game turn is not a full hour. You're like, all right, we've picked up the pace here. This is easier to understand. I got fewer questions about this. I can really lean into the social aspects, but get what I want. I understand how the deals work a little bit better, and bribery and everything else. And we're not flipping through the rule book as much. So yeah, we can get through that turn and feel like it's a good time. But it didn't wear us out at the end of the game. We want to play this again, and not wait 8 years before we do. So that's what I want to get to with it, and I think that we can.
Sounds great to me.
Well, all right. I think this is pretty good, and I think it's a subject that over the next year we're going to revisit, and we may I may ask Brad to sit down, especially as if information comes out or we learn anything, or as more people chime in. So if we get a lot of comments on this video, or people are like, why didn't you guys talk about this, or what do you guys think about that? So I imagine that I'm going to drag Brad back into TTS in another episode of Battle Language, and we may grab a few other concerned citizens or people with some crazy ideas and hear what they have to say. Yeah, I'm a huge Dune enthusiast, and I have been for 30 plus years, and it's my top 3 games of all time, and so I do want to see GaleForceNine make the most of whatever it is they're going to do with it for as long as they have the license. I like the idea of being able to say, yeah, it's the definitive edition, and they've nailed it. That's where I want to get with it, and I hope that we can get there. And yeah, maybe GaleForceNine will watch this and give them some ideas. They're gamers too, which is great. It's great working with them because they play these games, and they know what they like as well. So once we do engage more with them and get a sense of what they want to get out of this edition, that will be exciting for us as designers. And any last words from you, Brad?
Well, I'm just absolutely happy to participate whenever you call upon me. I've got more ideas myself, and some of them are a little crazy. So if you want to delve deeper into more fringe ideas, happy to add a few thoughts there too.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and that may very well be our topic. Let's go in and we'll all get out our crazy lists of the wildest things, and we'll see if we can get people to vote on it, or to give their thumbs up to, we like this one, we don't like that one, and we can be like, well, why not? And maybe that will lead to a sort of hybrid version that gets a little bit of that and that of the other. But yeah, I think that'll be fun, and I do anticipate we will continue to talk about this, whether we learn more about it over the next 8 to 12 months. It's going to be on our minds, and we will continue to talk about it. So thank you again, Brad, for joining me for this episode of Battle Language, and we are going to continue to do this. Let me know in the comments what you thought and any of your hopes and dreams about Dune, especially if you are somebody who is not a super Dune enthusiast. Let us know why and what it about the game has been keeping it off of your shelf or off of your table, as it were, and we'll want to talk about that as well. That's it for this one, everybody. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.